We'd have to say, Steve, it's been an unbelievable 2 years. You think what New Zealand Rugby's had to go through. Big launch this week of reimagining rugby. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what's happened over those last 2 years. The fact that all the things New Zealand Rugby faced through COVID and to where you are now. What's happened in those 2 years?
Yeah, it's been an interesting couple of years. So we've taken a few hits, as have a lot of sports and a lot of industries. We had a lot of plans in place. We've done a lot of work pre-COVID on how we're going to reimagine rugby, how we ensure that the community game stays strong, stays healthy. And then over the last couple of years, we've simply had to cut funding to programs, cut people, cut resources. And so now we're at a point of almost ground zero, I guess, where hopefully we can put that behind us. We've got our members' approval to move ahead with Silver Lake, and that allows us to start investing in growing the game again.
So let's talk about the fact, has this been the reset everyone was talking about? Because that was the conversation that CEO Mark Robinson was talking about. This is the chance for us to reset and look at things. Has that happened? Is this where this new reimagining rugby is going? And what are the major concerns going forward?
This gives us the opportunity for the reset that we're talking about. I mean, I think it would be naive to say that executing the transaction with Silver Lake is the reset in itself. But what it enables us to do is look at the future and plan for the future with resource behind us, with capability in the business that allows us to execute plans. It allows us to invest in new programs, invest in existing programs, and ensure that we can actually build into the future from a position of strength.
So if we look at what's happening now, and we look at the game, and we look at the community game, and you look at Silver Lake has taken a long time to get across the line.
Yeah.
Everyone's asking, though, where the investment is going to go. Look, what's the first protocol when you think about what Silver Lake's going to provide? What does that give back to the community game?
Yeah, so we've been really clear from day one that we see Silver Lake's investment benefiting the whole game, but we've also been very, very clear that the community game is an absolute priority and that we see this transaction giving us the opportunity to really invest in the community game. So in the short term, there'll be some distributions into the game, into provincial unions, into clubs and into our other members and critical stakeholders. So in the case of provincial unions, each NPC union will receive a $1 million distribution. Each Heartland union will receive a $500,000 distribution, and that's really to enable them to have their houses in order, to have the resilience to withstand any shocks that we might experience in the future, and to have a strong base across the system in which to move forward. Community clubs will also benefit, so there's a $7.5 million pot that we've allocated for distributions to community clubs. We recognise that we wouldn't be in a position to have Silver Lake invest in the business if it wasn't for the contribution that our clubs have made over the years. We're still working through exactly what the entitlements will be. Obviously there's a variety of clubs, different membership sizes, different settings. So we're working with our provincial unions at the moment on what the scale of that distribution will be. But there's $7.5 million there that will be applied directly into the community game.
What specifically is the role of each individual provincial union?
Yeah, so we actually asked ourselves and them exactly that question a couple of years ago. We went through an exercise of defining what is the purpose of a provincial union, and where we landed through a collaborative process was that the role of provincial unions is to foster the community game and to enable pathways to higher performance. So it's really about enabling their communities to have strong community games, and for those that have aspiration and potential to be able to access pathways to fulfil that.
So each individual union has been given a financial boost. How much of a role will New Zealand Rugby play in where that investment in the game is made in the community?
In the short term, we want to be relatively hands-off. So the intention is that the distributions get to the provincial unions as quickly as possible. So we've set three criteria for those distributions. The first is that provincial unions clear any debt that they might have to NZR. We're talking a very small number of unions in that case. The second is that they meet a reserves threshold so that we ensure that they've got the resilience financially to withstand any future challenges or shocks. Beyond that, we're simply asking that they invest any surplus in strategic rugby initiatives. We're not prescribing what those are, but what we are asking is that we receive a copy of a board resolution from each provincial union that sets out how they intend to invest those funds.
Is high performance and an NPC team, for example, is that deemed a place they should invest?
No, so that is one area that we wouldn't be comfortable releasing funds for investment into. We've been very clear right through this process, and the provincial unions have agreed with us that the area of greatest need is the community game, and that's really where we want to see this investment applied. So coming back to provincial unions' purpose and anchoring investment decisions around that, it's about fostering the community game, it's about enabling pathways to higher performance, so player development initiatives, absolutely, but we would draw the line at further investment into professional teams and programs.
This isn't a one-off payment though, right? There's an ongoing commitment to the community game going forward.
Yeah, so in the short term, there's a distribution which will land very quickly for provincial unions, as I say, that really to get their house in order. And then beyond that, we've also agreed a significant uplift in year-on-year funding for provincial unions. So pre-COVID, we were funding provincial unions to the tune of about $29 million across all 26. That will increase to at least $40 million per annum going forward. So a significant uplift in investment into provincial unions and provincial rugby.
So much talk about a thing called the Legacy Fund. What is the Legacy Fund?
Yeah, so the Legacy Fund's probably the third major element of community investment that will arise from the Silver Lake transaction. So initially there'll be a $60 million endowment established, and then our intention is that that 60 million is preserved over time, but that returns on that 60 million, investment returns, are invested back into the game. And in particular, we want to see that invested into community rugby priorities. So it'll operate a little bit like a gaming trust. There'll be a panel or an advisory group that will oversee applications and make recommendations to the NZR board for distributions. And again, that panel will have significant representation from the community game. Provincial unions will certainly have seats on that body, along with the NZR, and we will ensure that that money is invested into sort of big ticket items or projects or pilots or initiatives that will continue to sustain the community game.
Look, everyone's heard the saying, work smarter, not harder.
Yeah.
Do you think New Zealand Rugby's at that point now when you get that type of security in the provincial game that they can take more responsibility for the game in regards to coaching development, referee development, sideline behaviour, the support of those clubs? Is that the direction New Zealand Rugby is heading in terms of give the provincial unions the tools to deliver for their players, their management, their coaches, referees?
Yeah, so one thing we're really clear on is that with the scale of our game, NZ Rugby can't deliver everything, and we shouldn't. So the provincial unions are critical to fostering the game. And when I talk about that uplift in provincial union funding in particular, they will now have the means to invest significantly in initiatives that address all of those things that you've just mentioned. So coach and referee development, safe and inclusive environments, player recruitment, secondary school rugby, all of those areas are areas that we can now invest in. One of the other things, though, that we're really clear on is don't expect this to change our world overnight, because working smarter and not harder also doesn't mean just throwing lots of money at a problem. And so we want to ensure that we're really measured and strategic in how we invest in the future of the game. And so that might take us a little while before we start actually investing in programs and then seeing the benefit of those programs.
Is there a new energy in the building, given everything that's happened over the last probably 6 months, but everything you've had to deal with over the last 2 years? Clearly you've employed people back, there's directions you can go into, building looks great, like all the things that you want to do, but reality is, do you feel as though as a team you're really optimistic about the direction rugby can go? Yeah,
we're really optimistic, and I think the way you describe it, a new energy in the building, that's a really good way of describing this. We've been through a tough couple of years, we don't deny that. A lot of retrenchment, the community game's been impacted, there are less people engaged in the game for a variety of reasons. But having now got the support of our members to move ahead with Silver Lake, there's definitely a hell of a lot of energy in the system and a huge amount of optimism about where we can go.
Lastly, when do we find out more then? When do we find out what the next step is? Of course, Reimagining Rugby has been delivered this week, but that was certainly an overview. When do you really start nailing down the details and the community, the provincial unions, everyone will start seeing some of these initiatives?
We've been really mindful of not getting ahead of ourselves. There was no certainty that this would go ahead prior to the SGM 2 weeks ago. So really the work starts now. So we're establishing a number of working groups and different programs involving provincial unions, involving other stakeholders to really develop the detailed plans around how this will move forward. So in the short term, there'll be cash that will flow into the game through provincial unions, through clubs, and I think we'll see the impact of that quite quickly. But really, in terms of shifting the dial on participation, on keeping young men in the game, on meeting the growing demands for women and girls in the game, for ensuring that the game appeals to as many communities as possible within NZ. Those things are going to take a little bit of time. So don't expect to see things change next season, but I think we will start to see things changing gradually over the next 2-3 years.